So, I'm very much a person of when you start hammering a nail, there's no point stopping halfway through, you might as well drive the point home. And there's no better point to drive this home that Brexit is going to be an absolute disaster for Britain, not only short term, but long term as well. So, what I'm about to show you is a short clip from what was essentially a 2-hour talk by the American the American investors something or other. And basically this whole talk was about the opportunities that would arise in Brexit for not UK people, by the way. The entire thing was, what can Americans seize upon to take advantage of? And one of the people sitting at the conference was a guy called Adam Posen. Now, he, for many years, has been working at the Bank of England, and this is one of the guys that Nigel Farage called him a doomsayer. He was cast as one of the Project Fear people. Well, here you are about to see Adam bring the realities of how bad it's going to be for Brexit. And there's one part in particular that I find really fascinating, because Nigel Farage and these other people who were campaigning for Brexit said Brexit will not end any jobs. The jobs in the UK, they are safe. Well, we know that's far, far from truth. However, here you have Adam Posen, who literally goes and says, you have car manufacturing companies who will not invest in the UK manufacturing car industry because of this. In fact, he even points out the CEO from it's either Nissan or Toyota. It's one of those two. And, he basically says they're not investing in the UK anymore. So over time, the UK car manufacturing industry is just going to go poof. And he even said, at the moment in the manufacturing industry, in the car, they are oversubscribed for jobs. So where are these jobs going to go? They're not going to go from other places in Europe, they're going to go from the UK. So that's directly people losing their jobs. And you'll hear him say that in the video, as well as many other things. So I'll let the video play now, because the video speaks for itself. So enjoy, is all I've got to say. And let me know what you think about his comments as well, down below. And remember to share this with anyone who thinks Brexit is still a good idea.
What are the implications? Well, the implication is very simple. The UK economy is going to suffer what we call a negative supply shock, and in fact is already doing so. What is a negative supply shock? A negative supply shock means you are reducing the productive capacity of your economy, or the ability of your economy to purchase things for the same amount of money as you used to. And this takes several forms. Fundamentally, and again, this is something that I would hope in AEI would be religion. It is across the street at my shop. Putting up trade barriers is bad for your economy. The withdrawal from the EU is a form of putting up trade barriers. Full stop. Now, you can debate how much, how big, which industries, what happens in the end, but it is a withdrawal. Moreover, and this relates to some of the things Ambassador O'Sullivan said, it is a negative supply shock in that you are ruining your competitiveness specifically with your largest trading partner. It is a fact of life. It's one of the few things in economics we can talk about as a fact of life, that gravity applies. What is gravity? You trade far, far more with the countries you are contiguous with and the countries that you historically have interacted with than with countries that are far away. That is true for the US in the context of NAFTA. That is true for the UK. No matter how much there's been a special relationship, no matter how much the UK tries to be a global exporter, the fact is you've got more than twice as much trade with the EU, more than twice as much investment with the EU as you do with the US, or let alone the rest of the world. As David Cameron pointed out when Prime Minister while I was at the Bank of England, the UK does more trade with Ireland than they do with the BRIC countries combined: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So this is negative, full stop. And even if we were to get the kind of UK-US trade deal that Ambassador Bolton puts forward, I don't think we will, and I'll explain that at the very end if we have time. But even if we were, it would not matter very much compared to this shock. Additionally, because the UK had this special status as the less regulated, less low-tax, English-speaking, rule of law place, not that all of that was in question elsewhere in the EU, and certainly Ireland was similar, but had this special place, and people liked living in London, you had a huge amount of investment in the UK as a platform to enter the EU because you were part of the EU deal. That goes away. It may not go to zero. It will gradually come down. I see a representative, for example, of Toyota Motor Corporation here. Toyota, Nissan, Ford all have disproportionate amounts of their European auto production in the UK. All have indicated that they will not expand those production, will probably decline those production points in the UK when the UK loses full market access. Fourth, there's a distinction that gets made, and it was sort of there in Ambassador Bolton, and it was more there in Ambassador O'Sullivan's comments, which is important. There's a distinction between a trade deal and access to the single market. The single market is covering all those things that aren't simply the price of goods off the boat. It's whether your auto meets safety standards. It's whether your chemicals or your food additives have been recognized. It's whether you fit standard sizes of various objects. It's whether your accountants are accredited. It's whether your university degree is recognized in other countries' universities. Now, there's a large body of research in the US and Europe, some of it written at AEI, that says many of these things are restraints from trade. In reality, they are partially restraints from trade and partially economically beneficial because they set standards and make it easier to have large markets. In any given industry, there'll be more or less of those attributes. But so then the question is, since the UK primarily is an exporter of high-end products and of services especially, financial services, business services, media services, cultural services, educational services, how much do they lose by not being in the single market, even if you have a trade deal? And the answer is a lot. Most of the financial regulation that affected the UK was set in the UK and was not set by Brussels. And while the UK was in the EU, they had a predominant voice in the setting of those regulations in Brussels. Now, there will be no such interest. And that is why we are seeing, on estimates of my colleague Simeon Jankov, who runs the financial markets group at the London School of Economics, a third of city jobs, the economic and financial jobs in the city of London, will be moving to Dublin, Frankfurt, New York. So, full stop, this is bad economically. Now you can say, but this is for centuries. Over the long term, it'll be better. So then you have to think about what's wrong with the EU economy versus the UK economy. So most of us who see there being problems in the EU economy as a whole, or at least the Euro area economy, because frankly, Eastern Europe isn't doing so bad, tend to focus on five things. We say there's over-regulation of labor markets, there's heavy-handed regulation and other things, there's an excessive welfare state, there's demographic decline, and there's the problems of being associated with the Euro membership. Now, if you look at that list, 4 of those 5 do not apply to the UK, even as members of the EU. The UK has a looser labor market regulations than anyone else in the EU. The UK has a smaller welfare state than anyone else in the EU. The UK was a beneficiary in a demographic sense of people from Poland and France and Portugal and elsewhere and Romania coming and helping balance out the aging of their society. And the UK was, of course, not a member of the European monetary system. Even if the UK were to stay in the EU, none of that would change. So what is it getting? So you're balancing essentially non-financial regulation in certain areas being excessive versus all the other stuff I spoke about, and giving up the ability to affect or push back against those regulations in future because you will no longer be a member. Leave the rhetoric aside. Look at the reality. This is not a very good deal in economic terms. Now, again, you can always say, well, this is about sovereignty. They want to do it. Again, I'm not fit to say that. That's fine. But you should be aware that there is no economic upside to this. So the UK is going to have to cope with this economic aspect. They're going to have higher inflation, lower purchasing power, weaker pound. The pound has a ways to go yet because it mostly declined against the dollar, where, as I mentioned, there's more than twice as much trade and investment with Europe as with the dollar. So it has to adjust further against Europe. As my colleague, Lord Mervyn King, from the bank, then governor of the Bank of England, used to point out, the UK had a huge set of imbalances. The UK has very large budget deficits, has very large trade deficits. At some point, that means they're living beyond their savings, they have to pay it back. Well, what we've seen over the last few years and in the run-up since the Brexit is that we've seen a further boost of consumer borrowing while corporate investment has gone negative and trade has gone the wrong way. So in other words, the household balance sheets are getting worse, the government balance sheet is getting worse, the trade balance sheet is getting worse, at the same time that they are now going to be pulling themselves out of economies of scale in their biggest markets. And at the same time that there is inflation, which means the real purchasing power and ability to pay off those debts is going to go down. Not good. Do the mental exercise. If this was 1974 Britain, and you were on a fixed exchange rate and you had this set of macroeconomic indicators, you would be predicting a pound crash. Thankfully, Great Britain, UK, is not part of the euro area, does not have a fixed exchange rate. But if you do that exercise, it reminds you of just how unsustainable the current British path is. So then you have to go further into being mugged by reality. In this game, given that economic situation, what does the UK do? Well, the Theresa May government has made very clear that they intend to try to become Singapore on the Thames. They want to become the city-state alternative to the overregulated Europe. There are a dozen problems with this, but I will highlight one in particular. That Theresa May came out repeatedly saying, well, the way we're going to get around these immigration restrictions, which we're going to put in place, we're going to make it hard for EU people to have secured citizenship in the UK, we're going to control our borders, you know that phrase, and not let all this cheap labor and foreigners and Eastern Europeans in. But yet, all of business is really mad about this. Well, we're going to start allocating on an industry by industry, if not company by company basis, through our government, permits of who gets how many immigrants in which industry for the rest of the time. Again, this should be anathema to anyone in this building in AEI. It certainly is anathema to any market economist. Basically, this is the labor market program of the pre-Thatcher industrial policies of the Labour Party in the 70s and 60s, which Theresa May wants to reimpose on the British economy. So don't entertain the fantasy that this is going to make Britain this wonderful, like Hong Kong was in the 70s. It's going to make Britain like Britain was in the 70s. That is a step backward. That is a step away from freedom. That is a step away from prosperity. Again, as we've seen repeatedly, and not just in this country, popular votes at any given time can select things that are in bad self-interest. And political factors can rightly overcome economic concerns. But let us not mistake what are the actual economic implications of Brexit. And finally, I'll end on the fact of also what are the values? Because as people at AEI have repeatedly argued, rightly, the arguments for free markets are not just about economic efficiency, as Arthur Brooks has pointed out. They're about morality, they're about openness, they're about interchange with other peoples, they're about foreign policy. The people who voted for Brexit and the choices they are making to emphasize border control and symbolism of the European Court of Justice is an ideology that is about what we call in Britain Little England. It is an ideology that is ethno-nationalist. It is an ideology that distrusts free markets and competition. It is an ideology that distrusts change. Again, they have the right to do this, but do not kid yourself about what the values are. They are not values anything anyone in this building should support. I do want to second Ambassador O'Sullivan on some of the pushback on Ambassador Bolton about who's responsible for what. And it also, I think, is instructive for today. In September 1992, I was sitting in Chancellor Cole's office the day the UK dropped out of the exchange rate mechanism, okay? This was an accident of history that I happened to be there. It had no effect on anything, I can assure you, but I was there, okay? And so there are two important lessons from my having sat there that day that I would apply to today's discussion. The first is Cole, like Merkel now, is about German self-interest. They may like the automakers, they may like the ideal of Europe, and as David has argued, they view that as in Germany's enlightened self-interest. But they are not going to just roll over for this, that, or the other, as has been seen repeatedly throughout the European crisis. And so when Ambassador Bolton is introduced as someone fighting in the bio, I think you read out fighting vociferously or some other word for American national interest, the Germans, chancellors, fight pretty hard for German interest. And Helmut Kohl was perfectly content to watch the UK go bye-bye. That was a call from John Major. He left the room. He came back in the room, offered me a piece of cake. Kohl, like me, was a little overweight. And I said, well, you know what? And he's like, no, it's up to Britain. They want out, they get out. That was September 92, the exchange rate mechanism. So don't overdo the idea that Chancellor Merkel or the Germans or the Europeans are going to be cowed because a few German auto workers may be out of work. Remember, 18,000 employees is 1/20th of 1% of the German workforce. And there's huge overcapacity in the auto industry. It is naive at best to pretend that there is no racial component to this. If you look at the voting patterns in the UK, there is a very strong, statistically significant positive correlation between the diversity of the voting districts and the share that voted for Brexit. Full stop. It's almost a sufficient statistic to explain the vote. And you can say, well, that's something else, but I'm afraid I tend to look at facts. The final thing I would say, and I don't get into the process stuff like Ambassador O'Sullivan did, let's talk about effects. For anyone who's talking about the freedom of Eastern Europe or the freedom attained by US military preventing, and the NATO preventing Soviet incursions, talking about the transition to democracy in Spain and Portugal and Greece, as Ambassador O'Sullivan rightly did, or the US past, to talk about somehow political oppression of people in Britain in the last 20 years is shameful. All of you have seen, there is no meaningful political oppression. Again, you can decide as a British citizen that the symbols of what you vote on are very important to you. Legally, that's your right. But let's not gussy this up as though this is some great blow for freedom. We have all seen in our lifetimes what's going on. We are all seeing what's happening in Poland and Turkey right now, and Venezuela. That's oppression. There's nothing the EU is doing to oppress the people of the UK. I have a little bit of a political science background, so forgive me if I raise a different tack, which is referendum democracy is not the only way to do democracy. There's a reason why the US was a republic. There's a reason why in Britain, even though they've chosen to ignore it now, Parliament is sovereign, not the popular vote. The popular vote is binding in the political sense, but is in no sense legally or constitutionally binding in the UK. So, putting it differently, a poll just came out in the German press that a third of Bavarians would like to secede from Germany. I think it came out yesterday in Die Zeit. No, in Die Welt. You don't want elected officials or the appointees of elected officials completely ignoring popular opinion, but there's a reason why constitutions get drawn up with less degrees of responsiveness to popular opinion.